Bernie's original candidacy for president. I mean, I knew of him before that, and I was actually a big fan of him before that, but it was his candidacy for president that really got me to mobilize. And I think that, you know, it's kind of like one of those things where you learn from the teacher's teacher, you know, so I feel like this is a perfect opportunity to do that and have that moment. So this is an older one from 2011. It's a C-SPAN video. It is going to take us a little bit to get through it. So, and I'm actually going to we're going to probably do 2 of them tonight. So we're going to be in for some Eugene Debs overload, but that's okay. I think that more information is better than less. We'll take some breaks in between and watch some cart narcs and funny stuff so that we're not just ground into, you know, solely the the educational side of things. I know that's that can start to wane after a little bit, but we're going to get through some of this, and I think that you guys will really like it. I think it's a good spot to be in as far as content goes, because there's a lot there, and I think he's an important figure in our history. Cottonmouth 63, what red state am I in? I'm in Arizona. Some people want to call it a purple state, but if you look at our state legislature, it is definitely a red state. So there's that. And we have a Democratic senator named Kirsten Sinema who is acting much more like a Republican than a Democrat, I'll tell you that. So yeah, that's where I'm at, Cottonmouth 63. I'm in the desert hell. Oh, I'd love to move to California. If the cost of living was a little bit cheaper, or I could get a job that paid me substantially more where I'm located so that I could build up the revenue in order to move to California, I'd definitely do so. That's where I'm originally from, so going back to Cali is a dream of mine. Originally from San Diego, moved to Arizona when I was 12, and been stuck here ever since. So, yeah, Oregon's another place too. I love Oregon. Oregon's fucking beautiful. No question. That would be another place on the list. You're in South Carolina, Bree? Woo! That's rough gong. You gotta deal with Lindsey Graham and shit. Yeah, I don't know the moniker California fits, especially if you look at what PG&E has gotten away with in their free market. I think a lot of people bill California as commie-land, and they don't realize that there's a reason why it's like the 5th largest economy in the world, and that's because they're doing a lot of capitalist shit. I wish they were commie-fornia, or at least socialist-fornia. I'd be okay with socialist-fornia. We can't even get them there yet, though, so... Without further ado, I'm going to hop into this video. Feel free to keep commenting. I'll pause and talk to you guys as always. You know how we do.
Featured contender this week is Eugene V Debs. At the turn of the 20th century, a 5-time candidate for president on the Socialist ticket and the nation's most celebrated World War I protester. This December 1921 footage captures Debs on his return to his hometown of Terre, Haute, Indiana, following his release from prison by President Warren Harding after a federal conviction stemming...
I love the emote you just posted, Bree. That's awesome. That's so cool.
...from those war protests. And tonight, we are in Terre Haute in the Debs Home and Museum. Let me introduce you to one of our 2 guests who will be with us throughout our program tonight. Ernest Freeberg, who is a Debs biographer. His book is called Democracy's Prisoner, Eugene V Debs, The Great War and the Right to Dissent. Well, it's been 85 years since Debs died. Why do we care about him?
Debs was one of the most important labor leaders at a crucial time in conflict between labor and capital. But more importantly, he was the central figure in the socialist movement at a time when it was a viable, growing, an important part of the American political culture.
So is he interesting as a snapshot in time, or does he have a lasting legacy, do you think?
Well, I think like many third-party candidates, he and his fellow socialists managed to move the conversation in very important directions that have affected the development of American democracy ever since. So in that regard, he is of his time, but he's also had a long impact on us as well.
We will have time to delve into some of the elections more deeply later on, but of the 5 bids he made for the White House, are any particularly significant?
Well, 2 for very different reasons. The 1912 bid represents a high watermark of socialism, where he got about 6% of the vote. The more, or quite different election is 1920, where he was imprisoned in the Atlanta Penitentiary and got 1 million votes also while running in prison.
And we will learn more about both of those and his other bids for the White House as our 90-minute program, The Contenders, our look at people who made an attempt at the White House and failed, but had an effect on political and American history.
So this is a remarkable like echo of what we even see now. While we're not throwing socialists in prison now and labor leaders in prison now, they still the media does things to shun them or to put them in a bad light. They did it to Bernie, and they continue to do it. I don't even like the way she framed the question opening, basically like, why should we still care about this dude? You know. I think there is an inherent fucking like bitterness and aggression towards socialists and socialist ideology in this country, and I think it does come from something that was said a long time ago. It's often misattributed to John Steinbeck, but he said, you know, the reason socialism never took root in the United States is because our proletariat class is full of people who think they're a bunch of temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And none of these people are ever going to become millionaires, but they like to think that. And because they think that, they wouldn't let socialism, you know, kick in. Yeah. The lawyer actually isn't facing life in prison. He got like 9 months or something. He shouldn't have got anything. If we're talking about the same person that got held in contempt.
We're live tonight from the Debs House and Museum here in Terre, Haute, Indiana. It's on the campus of Indiana State University. And Eugene V. Debs lived in this house with his wife, Kate, and she lived here for years after he died. We'll show you more of the house as we continue here. The top floor of this house is an interesting mural. And the mural throughout the entire top floor depicts the years of Debs's public life. And throughout our program, we will be showing you aspects of that artwork to help illustrate Eugene V. Debs's story. Right now, let me introduce you to our second guest in the program. She is joining us from the second floor in what was Debs's bedroom. Now it is a museum room with a lot of artifacts in it. Lisa Phillips is a history professor at Indiana State University and a specialist in labor history. Lisa Phillips, thanks so much for being with us. Your thoughts on Debs's significance to the American story?
Oh, like Ernest said, I think that his significance has to do definitely with his activity in labor unions, the American Railway Union.
Yeah, I can't remember the guy's name too, but I saw that, and he basically was not turning over some emails or information on how he got information about Exxon Mobil, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Stephen Donziger, that's the guy. Mm-hmm. This is just to illustrate that, you know, these kind of movements, people in these kind of movements are fucking put into these kinds of positions all the time. All the fucking time. Now, Steve Donziger has experienced an extreme, very personal confinement as the pandemic arrived and then raged around him in New York City. On Sunday, Donziger reached his 600th day of unprecedented house arrest that has resulted from a sprawling, Kafkaesque legal battle with the oil giant Chevron. Donziger spearheaded a legendary crusade against the company on behalf of tens of thousands of indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest whose homes and health were devastated by oil pollution, only to himself become, as he describes it, the victim of a plan targeting by a corporation to destroy my life. Yeah, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because I want to keep on this Debs thing, but yeah, he's gone through some shit, and there are people out there that are still going through it. But I think to the scale that Debs went through it for his cause, I think it's a rare situation that we see that. Not that it doesn't happen. It does happen, but the propensity for it to happen is much more rare per capita these days than it was back when he was running for office and politically active.
And in the Socialist Party as well. And he has had a lasting effect on many of the laws that were passed during the Progressive era were as a result of his activism, some of which we still enjoy. And he certainly can tell us a lot about his time period through his running for president and through all of his labor union activities as well.
Lisa Phillips will be showing us some of the artifacts from time to time in the house here. She's also part of the Debs Foundation. Tell me about the work of the Debs Foundation and why you're involved in it.
The Debs Foundation seeks to keep the Debs legacy alive, and what it hopes to do is to promote not only the museum but the policies that Debs promoted, which is social justice and equality and the rights of workers generally. So it continues to try to live through the spirit of his mission. As
we turn to your expertise in understanding this house and what you showcase here, can you tell me a little bit about how this house is financed and functions, who pays for it, and whose care it's under?
It's paid for by the Debs Foundation, and it's cared for by Dr. Charles King and by Karen Brown, both of whom are here in Terre Haute and who run tours of the museum on a daily basis.
Well, to our viewers, in about 10 minutes or so, as we always do with these contenders programs, we're going to open up our phone lines and involve you in the discussion. Very interested to hear your questions or comments about Eugene V. Debs and the turn of the 20th century and that period in American history that he represents. Let me ask you a little bit about what made him a success at what he did.
Well, many people remember him most of all as a dynamic speaker. This is an era of wonderful stump speakers who could fill 2 and 3 hours with a speech. Debs, many said, was really the best in that genre, and in fact so good that he could afford to charge a modest admission for his audience, and that's how they funded the socialist campaigns in many cases. And he was just a very charismatic and had the ability. I think he began as a sort of staid Victorian speaker, but as he became more comfortable over the years, he developed a sort of more modern, impromptu style that really made a tremendous impact on his audience.
And over your shoulders is Debs' library, and my understanding is that Debs dropped out of school at age 14, and I'm curious about his extensive library and how he educated himself.
Well, he was very much self-taught. He worked very hard at that. He began as working in the railroad union and was very interested in the literature there. He worked for a while as a grocery clerk in town. Always wanted to get more education, but really had to rely on doing it on his own.
Lisa Phillips, how did Terre Haute shape Eugene Debs?
In many ways, mostly through his upbringing here when he was a younger man and a boy and a young man. And he always hearkened back to the Terre Haute of his youth, and he thought and invoked it all the time in terms of the harmonious relationships that he said developed in Old Terre Haute between not everybody, he said, could aspire to do something good in their lives, whether you be a business owner or whether you're a worker, but everybody had the chance, he always said, in Old Terre Haute to do something and to aspire to improve their lives, and that's what he held in the most regard, I think, in terms of his upbringing.
Well, when you walk around the house, you see that he was interested in politics from what looked like an early age. He made bid for clerk in this town and also made a successful bid for the Indiana legislature on the Democratic ticket. Yes. His early roots then were in two-party system. Can you talk about that?
I can say a little bit, which is to say that he ran on the Democratic Party ticket when he believed that he could form a relationship between multiple groups of people, whether they be business owners, workers, and he believed in the party system in that regard. It wasn't until later, in the 1880s, 1890s, that he felt like the party system through the Democrats and Republicans weren't working for the best interests of all the people combined.
So it kind of took a Bernie Sanders approach at first, where he was trying to work within the party he thought was most favorable for his movement, and when he realized that he couldn't make inroads through that, then he branched off and decided to run as a socialist candidate. So yeah, that right there already provides some insight as to Bernie's, Avenues, and Angles. I mean, this is the same exact thing that he did.
You saw at the White House. What was his intention? But did he ever really think that he could win?
He said very clearly that he had no intention of ever winning. Lincoln Steffens interviewed him in 1908 and said, what would it be like for you to be president? And he said that if the party ever gets close to winning, I'd be the last person who'd want the job or that they would put into the job. He really thought of himself more as an evangelist for the cause. I mean, he believed very much in democracy, but I think he was more interested in using the campaigns in order to generate interest among workers, to develop class consciousness, to sort of deliver his message very powerfully every 4 years.
Give us a snapshot of the America that he was dissatisfied with.
Well, it was an enormous concentration of capital. That was the big struggle at the time. You know, many people were worried about the labor problem. Many workers felt in the face of this rapid industrialization that their skills were less valuable, that their wages were being pitted in the national and international market where they're getting declining wages and a more difficult work environment. And there was an enormous sense that labor was deeply unhappy. And for Debs turned it around and said the problem is not labor, the problem is capital. That the real problem here is not that workers are unhappy and going on strike. The root problem is that these enormous concentrations of capital are undermining American democracy.
Socialism was, of course, on the rise in Europe. How was what the socialists and Debs were trying to do here different from what was happening there?
Well, it was similar at first. I mean, they considered themselves to be internationalists, that essentially socialism needed to be a worldwide movement, and that they expected that it would be.
Yeah, he do got some nice legs in that picture, don't he?
They felt that there were distinctive challenges in America in order to convince workers to do that, that there was a stronger sense of a working class in Europe on which to draw for socialist organizing there. So one of the struggles for Debs throughout his career was to trying to convince workers that they ought to think of themselves not as Democrats or Republicans, not on the basis of their religious affiliation, but to think of themselves as members of a working class.
Warm mittens, hot legs.
And how successful were he and his fellow thinkers in convincing the public? I mean, at the height of its popularity, how much ground did they make?
It depends on how you measure that. I think, if you measure it by Debs' success, as I said, his high watermark was 1912. He got 6% of the vote, about 1 million votes.
Never any electoral college votes, though, right?
No. And but there was a much broader, I mean, the socialists were much more successful at the local level. There were quite a number of socialist mayors, city officials of various kinds. There was a very vibrant international socialist society for college students started by Jack London. So a lot of college campus ferment about socialism. There was an enormously lively press. Some of our best journalism from that time period comes out of the socialist press, journals like The Masses out of Greenwich Village. So socialism was much bigger than counting the votes, I think.
And today in Congress, United States Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont is a socialist, and we talked to him about Debs's legacy. Let's listen to a bit of what he had to say.
A lot of the ideas that he advocated, talked about when people get old, there should be a social insurance for them. There should be retirement benefits for them. Well, that's what we call Social Security today. And amazingly enough, in the year 2011, there are those same people who hated Debs when he was alive but now want to destroy Social Security. And he believed that health care was a right of all people. That battle continues today. But I think it is fair to say that many of the huge advances made during the 30s under President Roosevelt, the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, and throughout, those were ideas that people like Debs probably brought to the attention. But it was the first person to bring to the attention of millions of working people.
And Lisa Phillips, let me ask you to add your perspectives to the America that he saw and was dissatisfied with, and ultimately...
Oh, hell yeah, Army, I can't wait to get it. I'm going to show it on stream. It's got to sit with me somewhere on stream so it can be seen at all times.
Whether or not he saw himself as anti-American or wanting to change America.
No, I don't think he saw himself as anti-American at all. In fact, I think he thought that he was advocating through his Socialist Party and labor union activity a kind of America that he hearkened back to again in the old days of Terre Haute, of one that was more community-centered and one that was less driven by big business. He wasn't, in his early days, he wasn't even anti-capitalist at all and worked with the railroad companies. But it wasn't until the advent of corporate capitalism or big business that he really felt as if there had to be a movement against that the for-profit motive that continued to bring everyday workers' wages down.
Well, let me ask you, you have something to add to that?
Well, I agree with Lisa. I think one of the things that made Debs so powerful was his ability to cast socialism as an American movement. His argument was that this is a revolutionary country in the first place, that fought a revolution for democracy, and in his lifetime he experienced the Civil War as a revolution. And so some of his greatest idols were the abolitionists. His argument was that the country had fought a battle to overthrow chattel slavery, and the next step is to overthrow wage slavery, as he called it.
A question for you. Who were his workers? Did he include women in his view of it? Did he include people other than whites? Did he include immigrants? What was his definition? Lisa.
Well, he as one of the first industrial union leaders, he was mounting a movement on behalf of the working class, which he believed everyone who was a worker, who earned wages, which were 2/3 of Americans by 1890, was a part of, whether they be an immigrant, whether they be black, whether they be women. So he certainly saw them as all members of a working class that needed to be uplifted in some.
Boom. He was fucking light years ahead of his times with that shit. People were not fucking directing this kind of movement towards people of color at this point. Like, this is something that is huge. Like, it is fucking massive. So, like, good on him for being ahead of his time, for real.
Some way, shape, or form. There's controversy still to this day among historians about whether he did enough on behalf of women and African Americans, and he had some trouble seeing immigrants, especially Chinese immigrants and Italian immigrants who came over temporarily and worked for very low wages and then brought them back to their home countries as part of the same American working class that was trying to fight for higher wages. So he had some trouble over the course of his career reconciling that, but certainly his as an industrial movement was one that recognized the rights of all workers, regardless of their backgrounds.
Now, I understand that you've got one of the artifacts is a copy of The Jungle of Upton Sinclair. What's the significance?
Well, it's a huge significance. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle and then published it in 1905. He was a member of the Socialist Party himself, and he highlighted in The Jungle the horrible conditions that meat packers worked in Chicago, and the conditions, what really riled up the country was...
Hey, Ann Prims, how you doing, man?
Was not only the conditions of the workers who were working in the meatpacking industry, but also the quality of the meat, the processed meat that was coming out of the plants. So he was the one who wrote about rats and people's fingers being caught in the processed meat and how horrible that was. So he worked. He and Debs were supporters of one another, and Upton Sinclair was able to, like Debs, demonstrate the problems with the growing growth of big business. And it was Upton Sinclair's work that led to the creation of the regulation of the food and meat industry.
I actually felt that when you said that, and Prim. Just living the dream one nightmare at a time, yep.
Industries, the precursors to the FDA. So very much of the same mindset in terms of demonstrating the negative consequences of big business.
The book actually ends with a scene where Jurgis wanders into a socialist meeting and hears a character who's clearly supposed to be Eugene Debs making a socialist speech. For Upton Sinclair, that was supposed to be, not food and drug regulations necessarily, although he supported those, but socialism was the bigger answer. So Debs is actually right in the book.
Would you, Lisa Phillips, tell us the story of his first imprisonment and how he got connected with the whole concept and thinking of socialism at that time?
Yes, he headed the American Railway Union, which had mounted a successful strike against the Great Northern Railroad Company, based in Minneapolis, and in 1893. And so the ARU, as a result of that strike, gained thousands and thousands of members with Debs as its head, and not many of those members were part of the Pullman Palace Car Company in 1894. And so they asked the ARU for support when they decided to walk out against George Pullman, who had dropped their wages as a result of the 1893 depression by 28%. And so once their wages were dropped, they wanted to walk out, and they asked the ARU, headed by Debs at that point, for support. Debs was reluctant at first. He thought it was too risky, but the Pullman workers had a lot of support, not only within Pullman, the town of Pullman, which is outside of Chicago, but also had a lot of support from railway workers all the way from there to St. Louis. So they staged what were some of the first boycott or sympathetic strikes along the railway lines, and it became national in scope. And as a result of that, President Grover Cleveland and the courts got involved and wanted to issue an injunction to stop the power of the ARU in stopping the transport of goods, and especially the U.S. mail, along the railways through that corridor. And so Grover Cleveland got involved in the U.S. He sent U.S. troops to open up the railway depots that had been shut down as a result of the strike that had been called by the ARU. And then Debs was ultimately didn't call the striking workers off and was found in contempt of court for not following the injunction. And so he served 3 months in prison as a result of being convicted of being in contempt of court. And so then, it was then when he was in prison after the Pullman strike that he was introduced to Socialist Party literature and became a Socialist Party member and then staunch advocate.
I read a description that he left prison, Ernie Freeberg, a changed man the first time. Do you know more about that?
Well, I think he did come to the realization. He felt that when the federal troops came in and smashed the strike, when he ended up in prison for defending the rights of workers, that it made it as clear as it could be that the two parties were both working against labor, and that there needed to be an alternative. He didn't go right away to socialism. He was involved in the Populist Party very actively initially, and then when that failed, then the Socialist Party emerged after that.
For our two guests, we're going to begin bringing your telephone calls into the mix. We've got the phone numbers, and we'll put them on the screen. They are 202-737-0001 if you live in the Eastern or Central time zones. If you're in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, 202-737-0002. And we'll mix calls in throughout our 90 minutes here. And as we take our first call, we want to give you a sense of where the house is in Terre Haute and on the campus of Indiana State University. So we're going to show you that via a great Google map as we listen to our first caller from Bath, North Carolina. This is Steve. Hi, Steve. You're on the air.
Please compare Debs with William Jennings Bryan in 1912, and for that matter, over their careers, because it seems like they are appealing or trying to appeal to a similar constituency.
Thanks very much. In the election of 1912, William Jennings Bryan was our earlier profile. So
right.
How did they compare?
Well, Debs was initially an admirer of Bryan, and I think that they shared some concerns about reform. I think the crucial difference is that Debs was really a revolutionary. He was not only interested in reform. Reform was necessary, but he felt that something much greater was needed, that there needed to be an end to capitalism and public ownership of the means of production. And that was a position that clearly distinguished him from Bryan's campaign.
That election, it was his first try, 1900. William.
So in other words, Bryan was a shit lib. And Debs was the real deal.
McKinley, William Jennings Bryan, and he got 0.6% of the popular vote that year. Do you know what his early appeals were as a candidate and how they changed over his many bids?
Well, the real challenge for Debs was to try to knit together socialists who were coming from very, very different positions. One of the strongest hotbeds of socialism was Oklahoma. The people who had been populists started.
Ooh, hotbed for socialism was Oklahoma? They also have great fucking weed laws right now. Their weed laws are fucking excellent, dude. It's so easy to get a dispensary license there. I think it costs like a few $100s, and just about anybody can get one.
Develop these socialist camp meetings where they would gather together to hear socialist speeches, and Debs was a real hero there. But the socialists needed to also speak to trade unionists in Chicago and Milwaukee, to radical bohemians in San Francisco and Greenwich Village, to Jewish garment workers on the Lower East Side. So the real challenge for Debs and for the party was to find a way to knit together people who all agreed on some level that
you know what I'm talking about, Holly Wars. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Capitalism needed to change fundamentally, but we're coming at this from very, very different positions. And so it took a while to build the apparatus.
Lisa Phillips, another election, 1908, which involved William Jennings Bryan. It looked like Debs was beginning to understand some early marketing because he had some campaign tactics like the Red Train Special and the Red Special Band. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
1908 was a critical year because of the ascendance of the popularity of the Socialist Party and because of the strength of labor unions and the American Federation of Labor and other labor unions in this period. So his message, I think, as Ernest was just saying, appealed to increasingly more people from a diverse amounts of backgrounds. So the Red Special would have been a good unifying kind of symbol to use to unite what were very disparate groups of people who were either working on farms or who were in urban areas. And so it meant to his supporters kind of a challenge to big business, a challenge to capitalism. They would have called it big business or monopolies in that period. So that's what Red then would have indicated in the 1908 election. So it was a good way to unify people with just the use of the Red Special.
Next telephone call is from Los Banos, California. This is a caller named Randy. Hi, Randy. Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of background. My grandfather actually voted for Eugene V Debs in his election. The other thing that I had is that as I went through school, through the primary grades of school,
yeah,
high
posters
school,
are dope,
we never heard of Eugene V Debs, and it seems like one of the things
those
that's
old
really
school
lacking in our education system is labor history. The fact that when people talk about Social Security, unemployment insurance, and many people, even older people, are surprised why people died for those benefits. They were not gifts. they were fought for, and people literally were killed and beaten and jailed for the right to unemployment insurance, or right to an 8-hour workday. With the neo-fascists that are now running on the Republican Party, trying to push the Republican Party further to the right, it seems like Eugene V Debs is not only important historically, but to reestablish that message now more than ever, because now I think we're in a critical part of history where if we're not careful, we could be drifting towards fascism. And
God, whoever this guy is talking, he is fucking nailing it, dude. Like, damn it. Preach, sir. Preach.
I think that Eugene V Debs' message now
Randy,
is probably more important than ever.
A question for you, Randy, before you go.
The question
did
is,
you talk
do you
about
think that
Debs with your grandfather? No, I understood your question. I'm asking you,
yes.
Did you talk with your grandfather about Debs?
Yes, I did.
And which election did he actually...
The
which election did he vote for?
The 1916 election, I believe.
That would be 1920.
1920. He actually 1916 was a year he sat out, as a matter of fact. Thank you, Randy. Appreciate it. Well, first of all, why did he sit out in 1916?
He was in ill health. I think he only ran in 1920 because of the unusual circumstances. He felt that it was time to pass on the baton of the movement to somebody else. He did run for Congress here in Indiana in 1916, but he didn't feel up to the Red Special. When he was on that Red Special train, he was giving 15 speeches a day, and he would come back exhausted to Terre, Haute and collapse, I guess, in one of the bedrooms upstairs and spend weeks trying to recover. So 1916, he decided to sit out.
Lisa Phillips, Randy's comments probably were music to your ears about the lack of teaching of labor history in schools. Now, you teach at the college level, but I'm wondering what you're thinking about teaching of labor history to America's students today.
Oh, of course I would say that it...
Oh, of course you're going to throw out the Megadeth fucking quotes while Holly Wars is in the chat, Mike. I see how it is. I see your angle.
It should be taught more than it is. I think that there's so much we can learn about working people, all of us who work every day and try to make ends meet, and to value them by teaching their history is very important. And it gives us a different perspective on what it means to fight for some of those rights that the caller was mentioning, and not take them for granted, and realize that as hard fought as they were fought for, they can and can be easily taken away and fought for again. So we need to really teach, I think, those struggles and how difficult it was, so that we don't simply take for granted the benefits that we've received as a result of them.
In the early parts of the 20th century, was there a middle?
Yeah, Dave changed when he got sober. Like, I wasn't a fan of Megadeth before, but now going back and listening to their older stuff and what he was talking about before, I fucking dig the shit out of the message. But he got old, he got sober, and he turned into a fucking weirdo.
Class in the United States?
Sure. Yes. I mean, a large part of corporate capitalism, it actually generated a much larger middle class.
And so the people that he represented, would they have been part of that middle class, or was the working class?
There were a large number of middle class supporters, people who went to Debs meetings expecting to see them be just working class people. Were often surprised to find that there were, actually many of the most important writers and political thinkers that we can think of from that time period were either members of the Socialist Party or at least very sympathetic to their agenda. So it was really. He considered it a working class movement, but it had a very strong leadership component from the middle class.
And the period 1900 to mid-1915 or so, would it have been dangerous to call yourself a socialist in the United States? Were the authorities watching you in any sort of way?
Well, no, I would say it was not. It was, I mean, there are particular incidents to be involved as a socialist in particular strike environments or was a problem. There was some conflict over the rights of soapbox speakers. The socialists were big believers in bringing their message to the street through soapbox oratory, and sometimes there were clashes with the police. But in terms of a sort of persecution of socialists, they were very much part of the political conversation in this period.
When did that change, and when did people, the public at large, begin to get more suspicious about intentions?
Well, when socialists started to get a lot of votes, that started the conversation. 1908 and 1912, Teddy Roosevelt called Debs one of our most undesirable citizens, an apostle of bloodshed and anarchy. So there was a sense that the forces of moderate opinion needed to push back against socialism rhetorically at first. And it wasn't really until World War I that the gloves really came off and socialism was sort of physically and legally assaulted.
Next is a caller named Cal watching us in Midtown Manhattan. You're on.
Hello. I'm loving the series. Just thank you for the series. Really fascinating history. Thank you. Just off the bat, there are a couple of things that just strike me, and hopefully your guests can comment on one or the other. One is the grievances against growing capitalism, strangling the rights of the people as it was thought of then, as it is now. as you know, like we have this protest in Lower Manhattan, Occupy Wall Street.
Oh, no, you didn't. You guys trying to make me work out while I'm fucking watching Eugene V Debs? You want squats? I can do the squats. The squats are easy. All right, give me a minute. I gotta set up my headphones so I can still hear. Hang on.
That seems to have,
give me that human
part of
butt.
the platform, some of the same grievances, as I understand them, and also the idea of the organization, the mechanics of the organization of the movement. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Occupy Wall Street is receiving a lot of criticism because they're making a deliberate attempt not to have a specific platform or agenda or a list of grievances. Maybe you can talk about the mechanics of organizing a movement as Debs understood it, and who might have inspired him in his life with things that he might have written. Thank you. Thank you for the series.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Cal. Let me ask Lisa to take up the question of what were his grievances against capitalism.
His grievances against capitalism were and it was monopoly, corporate capitalism, that he had the most trouble with, and that's why he thought that an overthrow of corporate capitalism was in order. And his grievances against them was the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few,
here you go.
and the controlling. What he argued early on was that combinations of corporations, of business owners would be able to get together to control many aspects of the economy, and that's what he was clearly against. So what he advocated were labor unions as similar combinations of workers who could then work together to break the monopolies that corporate entities had been forming with each other to control many aspects of the economy at the time. So in that way, people argue that our time period is very similar to Debs's time period in terms of the growing gap between the wealthy and the less than wealthy.
The mechanics that he used to organize them.
Well, I think that's an very interesting question. It is the case that socialists, one of the things that made Debsian socialism work in a way that has not worked in the country since is their talent for organizing, their willingness to attend a lot of meetings and to develop a separate independent press. They were very strong critics, in a way that sounds very, very modern, about the influence of big money on newspapers, on the media of the day.
Give me that human butt.
Very much believed that there was no way that people were going to hear the workers' side of the story or their side of the story if they didn't create their own alternative press. So that was crucial. I mean, Debs was the exciting person who blew into town and rallied the troops, but socialism really relied on much more of a grassroots organizing process and a lot of attempts to win at the local level. The presidency was out of reach, but it was not impossible to get on the city council.
But we also have to think about the time period. This is even before radio began. And so politics for Americans in those days meant what in their lives? I mean, was it an activity to fill the evenings in ways that we don't really appreciate today?
Well, sure. This was a period of enormous party loyalty. It was starting to fade in this time period, but not for...
And also social is, I guess, what I'm asking. Is
yes.
So people would gather in the evening and listen to speeches in ways that now we're busy with lives and have lots of media in our lives and that sort of thing.
And I think that there were many more newspaper sources, and they were much more barbed and polemical. Labor unions had their own press. So there was a much more complicated mix available to people in print.
Actually, while we're talking about media, Lisa Phillips, will you talk about a publication for which Debs wrote frequently called The Appeal to Reason?
Sure. Whoops. My earpiece came out for just a second, but it's sitting right here next to me. And this is the Appeal to Reason right here. And it was started in 1895 as a Populist Party newspaper. And it became the journal or the newspaper of the Socialist Party in 1901. And so it is one of those publications, many newspapers of which would have existed did exist in that time period, where people would read and find out as much information as they could. So it was Upton Sinclair, whose book we just showed earlier, was first serialized in the Appeal to Reason. So the first time it was published was here in the Appeal to Reason. Other people wrote in it. Debs wrote in it. Jack London wrote in it. So many authors of the period would have written first in the Appeal to Reason, which was after 1901 the Socialist Party's newspaper.
I'd like to very briefly read to you from a statement that Debs made after the 1912 election. He sent it by telegraph to be published in the Appeal to Reason. Results of the 1912 election, a statement. Here's just briefly. He wrote, "From the return at hand, it is now certain that the Socialist Party has doubled its national vote. Now that the battle is ours, we must lose no time in preparing for the next. We're the only ones who came out with colors flying." Debs wrote, "The Socialist Party from now on is the party of the people. This virile young giant will make history in the next few years. Soon after the Democrats go in power, they will demonstrate their utter impotency and helplessness, and thousands who voted their ticket will turn from them in disgust." How was he as a prognosticator?
That was a bad prediction.
Sure.
The Socialist Party actually started to decline right after that election, and at least in terms of membership, and never recovered that peak. And one of the main reasons, well, one of the main reasons was that the Wilson administration did just the opposite of what Debs predicted there. It brought in a slate of reforms, hour controls for 8-hour day for railroad workers, some regulation of the banking system, some gestures towards the right for unions to organize. Only steps, small steps toward what the socialists wanted, but certainly enough to win a lot of voters.
Let's take our next telephone call. It's from Cortland, New York, and this is Sharon on the line. Sharon, go ahead, please.
I want to thank C-SPAN for this wonderful series. I'm enjoying it so much. I'm wondering if your guest might comment on his early life, his formative years, and what his parents did for a living. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would you like to take that, Ernie Freeberg?
You know, I'm not exactly sure I can remember what Debs' father did for a living. They lived in Terre Haute. I know that he was a great idealist, and Debs himself is his middle name is after Victor Hugo.
Look at my dad. Look at my dad.
French novelist was a big part of Debs' upbringing.
I think it was family French extraction.
I don't want to cough over the video.
Very nice.
Yeah, Muriel's still kicking my ass.
Lisa Phillips?
Yeah, I was just remembering that Debs' father was a pork kind of a processor of pork in Terre Haute in a manufacturing plant, and was ill. He couldn't do that work, so there's reminiscences of his being depressed as a worker, and his wife was they had 2 small children, and she was pregnant with Eugene Debs, and so they opened a small grocery in the front of their house, and he went on to become a successful small grocer in Terre Haute. So his dad was a grocer, and so one of Debs' first jobs was as an accountant for the home and grocery line, and he had experience with the family business, and so that what enabled him to do that work. So that was what his family's income came from, having been a small involved in small business.
Why did he have to drop out of school at age 14?
To start working at the
As I
loading
recall,
docks?
I think it wasn't
Like
common
outcasts?
for people to finish high school, and he wanted to get a job on the railroads, because the railroads were the new and exciting thing for young men to become a part of. And so his very first job was as a paint scraper, I think, for the local railroad that was running through Terre Haute, that was coming through. It was owned by Chauncey.
Just to be clear, this was really common for young people to join the workforce. I mean, I'm talking at like ages like 10, 12, 14. This was very common. To put it into perspective, my own grandfather took off away from home at the age of 12 to work on the railroads, and he worked on the railroads, would spend months and months away from home, and then he'd come home. My great grandma had like a jar that had the money for the house in it, and he'd stick all the money in the jar that he made, and then he'd turn right back around and go back and work on the railroad all over again. He did that his whole basically childhood life, from the time he was 12 up. And then later on worked for a carnival. So that's a story for another time. But yeah, so this was common. This was really common for people to go and work on the railroads like that.
He rose first, and then by William McKean. So he was a paint scraper first, and it was a new and exciting job for him.
Yeah, I started at 5 selling my mom's encyclopedias to our neighbors for 10 cents a piece. I don't know if that was the most fruitful job I've ever had, though. So, you know.
In an era where people didn't as commonly finish high school.
While we're talking about his personal life, can either of you tell us about his marriage?
That was always a source of controversy in the movement. He was deeply loyal to Kate Debs, but it was pretty clear that she married him as an aspiring young grocer and congressman, and not as a socialist. She's often spoke in favor of socialism publicly, but not enthusiastically. Many decided that she was probably would have been happier if he had not pursued that life, which also kept him on the road most of the time. I mean, Debs was back in Terre Haute mostly to collapse upstairs and try to recover before he headed out on another campaign. So she was left keeping the home fires burning here in this lovely house.
So Kate spent a lot of time in the living room where we are right now, in this house in Terre Haute, Indiana.
With sort of down and out railroad workers knocking at the door and hoping that they could see their hero.
Did they ever have any children?
No.
And you said that he traveled extensively, and she chose never to do that, or we don't even know if she was invited to come along. Hard to know what was going on, right?
Yeah.
Let's take our next telephone call from Terre Haute, Indiana. This is Tom. Hi, Tom. Here we are in your hometown. Have you been to the Debs house?
No, I have not. I work 2 blocks away from there, and so I have no excuse for that. But thank you for a fantastic series. I would just like to make a quick comment, because there are so many people across America would love to be calling. I just lucked out to do it. But I just want to say this. When the unions and socialism came about because of the lack of benevolent employers. And I want to make one point. I lived in Colorado, and I worked with Westinghouse, and I called on the mines of Colorado. And I used to drive through southern Colorado on interstate.
It's a conversation about Eugene V Debs, just basically like where he came from, like what his upbringing was, how he got into political movements. I just wanted to do some more leftist philosophy stuff. I talk a lot about current events, but I kind of don't really touch on why I believe what I believe, and I guess some of the deeper underpinnings of it. So I felt like this was an important undertaking.
Day 25, and I would pass a town called Ludlow, and I would ask Ms. Phillips if she knows anything about the Ludlow Massacre, and I'm not sure when it happened.
I've seen the needle
I'm sure
use the
Debs
man.
was alive at the time. But I would just hang up now and please ponder what I've said. You moguls of America, who we need jobs, and we need them now. So please, could you tell us a little bit about the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado? Thank you.
Well, the Ludlow Massacre and several other massacres or riots of that time period were often blamed on the striking workers or the protesting workers at the time, whether they be miners or whether they be protesting for their rights. What happened in Ludlow, which happened in Haymarket, which happened in other riotous incidents, were that
socialists shave with a straight razor and very carefully.
There would be federal troops or other authorities brought in to quell the protesting workers, and many of them would be killed. So I can't remember how many people died in the Ludlow Massacre, but in Haymarket and in other riots, in the Homestead Strike, several people would be killed, and then the unions or the striking workers would be blamed for having caused a riot and for protesting. And so that caused a lot of negative. That was part of the reason why a precursor to the ARU, the Knights of Labor, went by the wayside, because they were blamed in part for the Haymarket riot, which caused the deaths of several people. So the Ludlow Massacre, similarly, was an incident where striking workers were killed, and where people were blamed. The strikers themselves were blamed, unfortunately, for that. I think, to get to the caller's original point, what Debs actually wanted was a return to
waxings for capitalists.
the benevolent employer. He had been friends with people in Terre Haute, like William McKean, who owns part of the railroad that came through Terre Haute, who he supported when they had the best interests of Terre Haute in mind. It was when they brought in what McKean called, and others of the period called, heavy capitalists, and when they started trying to make relationships with people out east, that Debs started to break his ties with smaller business owners in places like Terre Haute, and started criticizing them for their need for profit. So it wasn't small business that he originally was against. It was the for-profit motive that drove those small businessmen to become business moguls, and then create conditions that caused the Ludlow Massacre and the Haymarket riot among workers who they didn't think any other choice but to strike.
Were there socialists all across the United States, or was it a regional phenomenon, Lisa?
Oh, no, it was all across the United States. Here in the Midwest, and also out west, especially with the Western Federation of Miners. They were big supporters of the Socialist Party. Big Bill Haywood was a founding member of it. So there were, mostly out west, Oklahoma, as Ernest said, the Midwest and in the East and places like New York were the strongholds of the Socialist Party. But the remarkable thing about the Socialists was they drew support from rural Americans and farms who were being affected negatively by capitalism, from urban areas like Chicago and New York, from Western coal miners. So they drew support from lots of people who were similarly negatively affected by the rise of this corporate kind of capitalism.
You had a thought you wanted to add?
Well, I think rather than moving toward more benevolent employers, Debs, I don't think, believed that was possible at this point. I think rather than ending monopoly capitalism and going back to small-scale capitalism, Socialists were interested in, they were basically arguing that business will get bigger and bigger. The important thing is for it to be run by the people rather than by individuals for private gain. So this is a much more radical proposition as a way to solve this problem. I mean, there were plenty of people, including capitalists, who were seriously engaged with trying to figure out how to soften the hard edges of the Industrial Revolution that was going on. Andrew Carnegie, most notably with his Gospel of Wealth, suggested that there needed to be more benevolent moguls. Debs said that's not the problem. Essentially, we need to continue to build monopolies and then take them for the people.
We are profiling Eugene V Debs at his home in Terre Haute, Indiana, in our series The Contender, which looks at 14 men who tried for the presidency and lost but changed American history. We have 90 minutes tonight to learn more about his period of time. His 5 runs for the presidency were from 1900 through 1920. And for our 2 guests here in Terre Haute, our next telephone call is from Annandale, Virginia, outside Washington. This is John. Hi, John.
Hi, Susan. Wonderful program, and thanks for C-SPAN. I was intrigued by your guest's comment
Megadeth should change their name from Megadeth to Boomer Death.
That Teddy Roosevelt said that Eugene Debs was the most dangerous man in America or something to that effect. When Teddy Roosevelt himself is known as a trust buster and breaking up Standard Oil and the like, so it would seem that they would have at least some things in common. I wonder if your guest could comment on that.
Ernie Freeberg.
Sure. Very good question. Roosevelt said we need to take what he called the sane part of the Debsian program and adopt it. That Debs, with his interest in taking over.
Now, Holly Wars, don't go threatening me with the good time that you can't fulfill on. Don't make promises you can't keep.
For private industry and trying to run it through the people democratically, that this was a crazy idea that would undermine one of the pillars of American democracy in private property and free enterprise. On the other hand, he was well aware of the growing concern among workers as well as the middle class about the problems of big business. So he basically, Roosevelt argued that it was important to take the good ideas, the things that we now have inherited from the socialist movement in many ways that we've been talking about, and to adopt those. So these became an important part of his Progressive Party platform, and were also part of the reform agenda for the Wilson administration. He said, Debs wants to tear down in a spirit of hate by stirring up class envy, workers against their masters, in a sense. But what he wanted to do was to socialize the country in a different way without socialism.
Louise Phillips, you have more to add on that question?
I think, too, I might be remembering this wrong, but I don't think Teddy Roosevelt supported nationwide strikes of the type that happened under the ARU with Pullman, so that...
Chips, dips, chains, and whips, baby. Chips, dips, chains, and whips.
That seemed very dangerous to presidents who were in charge of making sure that the country ran smoothly. So anytime you saw a case where there was a strike fomented by a national labor union that disrupted the distribution of goods, and something as crucial as the mail in that time period, then that too would have put Teddy Roosevelt and Eugene Debs on opposite sides of the divide there around how strong you should be in terms of being able to stop business from functioning.
Another topic altogether to understand socialist thinking in the United States in the early 20th century. What about the intersection between socialist thinking and religion?
A very large number of socialists were religious, especially in the South, in Oklahoma, Texas. There was a strong party there, and a very strong movement of what was called the social gospel or social Christianity. Many of those people were supporters of Debs. Even though Debs himself was a believer only in the most tenuous sense, he considered churches to be the enemy, sort of a part of the apparatus to oppress workers, particularly the Catholic Church. He was very critical. Claimed never to go into a church. But many Christians felt that he, in his sort of humanitarian compassion for workers, really exemplified. Just a tremendous number of people over the course of his career said that, I don't know what he believes, but he's the most Christ-like person that I know, that his compassion for the underdog is the essence of Christianity. So there was this is an important distinction, I think, between the Debsian socialist movement and, say, the communist movement that comes after that, is that it was very much capable, not everybody in that socialist movement was a believer by any means, but it was something where that was an important part of the mix.
If you signed your name to a card that said...
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of our social safety net, even as it was being developed, was very much tied to evangelical Christians. Like, they were actually much more to the left than they have been in the last 30 years. because they did believe in tenets like we need to take care of one another. They believed in those things because it's fundamentally tied to their religion. I think what happened at a certain point, you had people like interject politics into the religion much more than previously. And once that happened, they used fear-mongering tactics to fucking switch shit up. I need to get some sleep. Good night, everyone. Have fun stream. Duty, thank you so much for hanging out with us. I hope that you enjoy the new dog. I'm sorry about the loss of your of Duty, and you know, our thoughts are with you. And you know, pop into the community, send you memes or some shit if you're in Discord or whatever. So yeah, let us know how you're doing, and I hope you have a good and restful night, and you're enjoying the new pup.
That I'm a member of the Socialist Party in this time period. What did that mean? The core of your beliefs were?
That the most important struggle was a struggle between the working class and the owning class, and that this was inevitably going to result in a victory for the working class as a necessary next step in the evolution of history, and for American socialists, I think, a necessary next step to realize or to protect the principles of the American Revolution, sort of the dignity of individuals, but embodied in their ability to participate equally in their economy.
So very much thought of themselves as patriots. We've touched on that theme before.
Yes.
Harkening back to, I mean, he spoke of Lincoln and also of some of the founding fathers in his writing. So he really saw himself as an extension of the early roots of American history.
Defining American, you know, the important movers and shakers in American history as being radicals. You know, that history is driven forward by people. You know, he would point back to Jesus, to Socrates, to Thomas Jefferson, to John Brown, Wendell Phillips. You know, that history moves forward by people who, you know, start out with an idea that seems deeply unpopular, but in retrospect is the necessary next step for moral evolution.
We have a Hoosier for our next call from Bloomington. This is Chris on the line. Hello, Chris. Welcome to the conversation.
Hey, thanks for having the conversation. It's a great surprise to see on television tonight. So I was wondering if your guests would be able to comment on Debs' relationship with the industrial workers of the world and with general strike in Seattle in 1990.
All right, Lisa Phillips, the IWW.
Yes, Debs was a founding member of the IWW, which started in 1905, and the IWW was a clearly an industrial union movement, so it was juxtaposed against the American Federation of Labor, which was more of a craft skilled workers-based union. So the IWW was, like what Debs advocated with socialism, was a movement among a working class of people, and it saw its boundaries not as nationalistic, and it sought to work with workers in other countries, Spain, France, Italy, and as a part of a kind of a, I mean, this never came to be, but they saw themselves as a part of a workers' movement among workers fighting capital worldwide rather than just within the United States. So it very much fit with Debs's later interpretation of what had to be done to promote the rights of workers, not only in the United States, but in other places in the world as well.
Was he affiliated with them throughout his life?
No, there was a split within it's kind of complicated, but there was a split within the IWW over the Socialist Party there was a split within the Socialist Party that affected the IWW, and so he remained very much supported the IWW, but took less of a leadership position once rival Socialist Party leaders, I think it was Morris Hillquit, and Big Bill Haywood kind of took over the IWW, or at least brought it into a different vision than Debs had in mind.
Was the IWW the Wobblies?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most important breaks was over the issue of violence or sabotage. You know, the Wobblies argued, and this was a tough bunch in a very tough environment, working in the mines and lumber fields. And they argued that there were times when, in order to advance their cause, they needed to use sabotage or other forms of violence in order to fight back.
And did Debs agree with that?
Debs did not agree with that. He wasn't a pacifist. He recognized there were times when you needed to use violence, but he felt that the strategy of advocating violence was not appropriate for American democracy, and that in fact workers always lost when they tried violence. Most of the power to spread violence around belonged to the state.
Next up is Minneapolis, and this is Ken. Hi, Ken.
Yes, hello. This is Ken in Minneapolis. Thank you to C-SPAN for this wonderful series. I can hardly wait for George McGovern. And I work in public radio, And a little bit earlier, your scholars were talking about Debs and media. And in New York City, there is or was a famous radio station, WEVD, named for Eugene V Debs, and it debuted in the early 1920s, and it was one of the nation's first non-commercial, listener-supported.
See, now, Holly Wars, you are the only one with your own alert. Just for you. I mean, because we took CTVs away. Jason.
Radio stations. And given Debs' name in the call letters, I'm curious if he had any involvement with that radio station.
Thanks. His demise was in 1926. Radio just beginning to come on the scene as a medium. Did he have a connection?
No, it's an homage to him, but he had no direct connection to it.
Lisa, we only have 35 minutes left already. This program's going by pretty quickly here.
Nothing like getting called out by Density online. Triggering Density in his own chat. That's what I'm calling him from now on, Density.
A question for you about Debs, if you can answer this, is if he were to walk into this room, we're surrounded by images of him all over this house. It's really interesting how many you all have preserved here in the foundation. But can you give us a sense of how tall a man he was? Was he slight? Give us a personal glimpse of him if you can.
As far as I know, I think he was 6'2" or 3". Ernest, I'm not sure if that's correct, but
that's about right. Yeah.
And I think that he was always very thin, so he's very lanky. You can see that in the pictures of him, and he was that way from his youth on, and so he was a commanding figure, but he was not burly, I guess I would say. So
you told me, Ernie Freeberger, that he was also an advocate of some of the contemporary eating fads of the days, of some more early holistic health. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, he was often ill, and it was hard to pin down just what the problem was. I think some biographers have suggested it was a sort of nervous exhaustion from these hard campaigns, the stress that he was under, and he would often retreat to try to recover, and he would find his way to these sanitariums where he would experiment with walnuts and a ketchup diet and sleeping with his head oriented toward the north and these sorts of things, and often would write letters back to his dear brother suggesting that these things were working out just great for him. So
now, switching gears here in our time, as the nation began to march toward World War I, what happened to the labor movement as all this international political turmoil in this country was making these big decisions about its role in that?
Sure. Well, when the war first broke out in Europe, most Americans, workers and otherwise, were really very determined to keep out of the war. And there were isolationists, especially in the Midwest and in the South, who said, there was God gave us the Atlantic Ocean for a very good reason, and that's to not get involved in European war.
What's the redneck sound with the finger? I'm trying to figure out what that is, Holly Wars. Oh, who? Density? I have it if you're talking about this video, it's sped up. Because otherwise it's there, like I've got a lot of content we're going to do. And so I usually put it on like 125, but if he sounds like he's talking real fast, that's why. It's not Ben Shapiro, I promise.
Or the many large immigrant groups in the country were deeply divided about the conflict overseas, but didn't want to participate helping the other side. And so there was a strong push for neutrality initially, really until things escalated out of control. Wilson himself was elected for a second term, campaigning that he had kept the country out of war, that he was a negotiator for peace. Just weeks after being inaugurated for a second term, he started to move the country to war.
And I want to show our viewers your book, because we're now getting into your subject area, Democracy's Prisoner, Eugene V Debs.
A lot of times when we watch these, we'll watch them on 1.5 even, so they're even more fast. It's like this.
Great War and the Right to Dissent. In 1917, Congress passed a law about speech about the war. Would you tell our viewers what that law was?
Sure. It's called the Espionage Act, but it actually was never used to convict any spies during the war. There were German spies, and so much of the law dealt with that. But there were also provisions there that allowed for the government to have enormous control over dissent. The postmaster was given the power to ban any publication that was publishing anything that the postmaster considered to be not supportive of the war, not sufficiently patriotic. And anybody who was deemed to give us to say anything that was discouraging of the war effort was liable to a $10,000 fine and 10 to 20 years in prison.
Well, obviously, today we look at it and say First Amendment challenges all over this. Did the Supreme Court ever hear the law?
Yep, they did. Debs was one of the important test cases. There were 3 test cases that came up. About 1,200 people were convicted under this Espionage Act.
And were sent to prison.
And were sent to prison. And the Supreme Court unanimously supported it at that point.
Now, Debs began to be anti-war at what point?
Well, he was as I said earlier, he wasn't a pacifist. He said there are some wars. There is a class struggle in which it might make sense at some point to take up arms. And he felt that the Civil War was an appropriate use of arms. But he considered the war in Europe to be, the socialist argument was that this was a clash between competing empires over colonies, and that the only people who were going to benefit, I mean, the old phrase, a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, that there was lots of money to be made in the war, but the working people were the ones who were going to suffer. And that was the socialist position. When the war broke out, when Wilson and Congress moved to war, the socialists gathered a few days later in St. Louis and passed a proclamation vowing that they were going to fight the war rhetorically in every possible way they could and fight the draft actively. A number of socialists broke from the party at that point. Upton Sinclair, we've been talking about, he felt as if that was the wrong move. Others worried that the party would be destroyed by this, that it would be labeled un-American. But Debs and quite a number of the party decided that it was a stand they needed to take.
I'm going to take a call from Reed in Nashville, Tennessee, and then ask you about what the popular view in America was about the draft at that time. Reed, your question, please.
How do you do? Thank you again, of course, for your discussion tonight. It's very wonderful. But I do want to take...
Thanks for watching.
Yes. Unfortunately, really, socialism, Debs, and the ideal of the key word meaning central planning. And that would mean that there is a group who involve themselves in the central planning of our economy or our society. And that leads itself to a small group who define how citizens should behave. And I want to say that socialism, although wonderful in its ideals, and communism its ideals and all that, it does not truly exist. And I believe that James Madison described it correctly, that unfortunately, for good or bad, we are in competition with one another. And that is what satisfies. So that leads to individual freedom. Central planning leads to a small group, which today reflects today, as we want someone who central plans our society as to who benefits and who doesn't benefit. It just leads to someone in a small group calling who wins and who loses. And thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks, Reed. Lisa Phillips, comments for Reed.
Actually, that was not too far off from Debs's position, believe it or not, because what he was arguing was that the central planners of his day were these large business owners, the Andrew Carnegies, the J.D. Rockefellers, the Cornelius Vanderbilts, who had a lot of political power and influence, and who, in essence, through monopoly formation, were the central planners of the economy in that period. So he would have been with you on that. But he just wanted there to be a more diverse group of people, working people, who had a role in the planning of the economy and how wealth was distributed. So he was against the central planning that was being done in the period by very wealthy, by that point, Americans and business owners.
Right, in the interest of time here, we were talking about the draft, but I want to go on to his position on the draft and his famous speech in Canton, Ohio. To share with our viewers, it was a speech that ended up having Debs arrested. And just to get a flavor of it, here is one of 2 quotes. "The working class, who freely shed their blood and furnished the corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. Yours not to reason why, yours but to do and die. If war is right, let it be declared by the people." When he made that speech, did he know he was going to go to jail?
He had to know that it was likely. He knew that there were federal agents, stenographers in the audience taking down what he had to say. I think he gave a number of speeches along the same lines up to that point and had not been arrested. He said at the start of the speech, "I need to be careful what I say. I'm not going to say anything I don't believe, but I have to be careful. I know I'm being watched." And the audience fully understood the situation. He spent a lot of that time in that speech denouncing the fact that many of his comrades were already in prison. And he said, if they're guilty, I'm guilty.
What was his trial like? Was it a big national event when he was on trial?
Yes, it certainly was. It was in Cleveland. And Debs got an opportunity to make 2 very powerful speeches about socialism in front of a national audience. His lawyers, hoped to get him off on a technicality, and they were also interested in making a very strong free speech argument in his defense. He felt as if the system was rigged, that the judiciary was in the pockets of big business, and it was more important for him to take this opportunity to win a propaganda coup for socialism by sort of laying out his life's work.
And he ultimately was sentenced to 10 years. You said that the possible terms were up to 20. Is that
yes,
right?
That's
so
right.
10 was the view how?
It's hard to say that he got a break. He was an older man at that point in not good health. And when he went off to prison, it was many people assumed that if he didn't get out, he would have died in prison.
I will do terrible violence.
We're about 20 minutes left. We're going to take a couple calls and then talk about his 1920 campaign from inside the Atlanta federal prison. Tecumseh, Oklahoma. Donna, go ahead, please.
Hi, I am so happy to hear this program. I can't tell you how grateful I am to have it over the air. A little comment about Ludlow, Colorado.
Listen to that Oklahoman socialist. Oh, there really was a socialist roots in Oklahoma. Awesome.
I was a very good friend of a woman who is my mother's age, and she talked about her parents being part of what happened in Ludlow. And she told me, because I was going on a road trip with my son, to look for a sign just north of Trinidad alongside the road, and all it will say is, "This is the place." And that is the place where my friend Terry's mother and father ran down a dry riverbed with shots fired all around them, running for their lives. The second thing I'd like to say is a little something about Upton.
This is from 2011, Dog Barks. I'll post a link in the chat.
Sinclair. I lived for several years in San Pedro, California, the land of dock workers. And Upton Sinclair was arrested in San Pedro for reading the Constitution to the dock workers. And that began the Southern California ACLU. And the third comment is that I have moved back to Oklahoma. I've been gone for about 50 years. I lived here as a teenager. But I went to a labor rally in support of the Wisconsin public employees and was on the state capitol.
Hey, what's up? Captain A. Jones raiding with a party of 8. Didn't even hear my alerts go off. I don't know what's up with that. I got to figure that shit out. But I appreciate the raid. Hell yes. If you guys don't follow Captain A. Jones, I saw a couple of you actually on his stream earlier before I started tonight, and I was like, yes, the community is spreading. We're getting more attention to us. And I love that people are watching Captain A, dude. He's freaking awesome. I am going to give him a shout out right now. And thank you so much for the raid. Give me that human butt. Yeah, and that too. But we're watching just kind of this C-SPAN. It's kind of like a documentary. Call-in questions about Eugene V Debs. Felt it was really important to kind of elucidate a little bit more where my views come from and the philosophies come from. So, why not go straight to the source and talk about one of the fathers of the American labor movement, Eugene Debs. So that's where we're at right now. And after that, we're going to hop into the Destiny debate and go through the most recent one at Better Discourse and do that whole thing. So thanks for hanging out with us. Definitely hit that follow button if you want to hear more or see more from me. You guys fucking rock.
Steps, and a friend of mine stood next to me with a little sign in Latin, and she told me that it was the Oklahoma state motto, and it was from a socialist desire, and it is labor.
Nerdidity. Oh yeah, I gotta give you guys the booms. I give the booms back to the Captain A. Jones community specifically because it's solidarity with Captain A. Jones, man. That's what that's all about. I decided it's not trademark infringement because I really only do it with you guys because hey, solidarity, man, solidarity
conquers all. And now we are the reddest state in the union, which is kind of an ironic thing.
Donna, thank you so much for your comments. We'll let that stand and take a telephone call from Eric in Los Angeles. Eric, go ahead, please.
Yes, hello, this is Eric, and I also am enjoying the program. And I think that Eugene Debs really tried to keep us to our ideals. and so my question, though, is about Joe Perriman, who was a Christian socialist who ran on the ticket with Debs in 1900, and then later was involved in the trial of the McNamara brothers, who were accused of using sabotage to further their cause. And Joe Perriman was one of the attorneys along with Clarence Darrow. But I know that Debs...
Thanks for the follow, Space Explorer, for that. On the low, I like to do dabs. So I do dabs when people follow me because it makes me feel good about myself. It's like a celebration. Come on, cook, dab, cook. I'm using a Puffco Peak right now. I love these little things. They're fucking awesome. If you guys haven't used one, oh, I feel fucking spoiled. Her name is Muriel. She was named by Holly Ward. She's in here too.
Defended in print the McNamara's, and I wondered if they could comment about that. Thank you.
Lisa Phillips, is this
Indeed, Captain A. Jones did pioneer the boom squad.
a period of Deb's life that you can fill us in on?
I don't know enough. I don't know enough about it, but I do know that I failed to mention earlier that Clarence Darrow was a big part of Eugene Debs' defense in 1894 after he was accused of being convicted for contempt of court with the injunction after the Pullman strike. But I don't know enough about Joe Perriman to comment on his involvement with Debs or with the McNamara brothers. So,
Debs did not intend to justify the dynamiting of the building, which was the Los Angeles Times building, which was the center of a tremendous anti-labor, anti-socialist sentiment at that point. He believed that the McNamara's were innocent, and so much of his defense of them was really based on belief.
It's all about the narrative you create, Captain A. Jones. It's all about the narrative you create around the boom. Can you create a broad enough narrative to convince people that it was actually you? That's all you need, baby. I think we can do this. I think we can do this. I think we can do this, Captain A.
Believing that this was a false charge.
His second sentencing was under the Espionage Act, and he made a speech at his sentencing. One of his quotes from that time is among Eugene V. Debs' most famous. It's this: "I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." He went to prison, and then the 1920 campaign, which he decided to take part in. Can you tell me, Ernie Freeberg, about how he campaigned for president from his prison cell in Atlanta? How did he do that?
Well, he was not allowed. It was an awkward situation for the federal government because he was a seditionist being jailed, but he was also a legitimate candidate from a legitimate legal party. They actually showed up and presented him with flags.
He may be a real poo, though. Poo. He's definitely not a real pie, but he may be a real poo.
Flowers and nominated him, allowed him to give a little speech. The Socialist did. But then the government allowed him only to campaign by submitting, I think it was 8 500-word letters to the press. Somebody who had been on the Red Special and giving hundreds of speeches was basically spending the campaign relying on his party to go out and spread the word.
Lisa Phillips, you have one of his campaign buttons. Can you show it to us?
Here it is.
And it's very small. What does it say?
It says, let's see, convict number 9653 for president. It's one of the most famous campaign buttons for president in U.S. history. It's one of the only like it.
Dude, I want a poster of that. I want a poster of that fucking button. I wonder where I could get that. Like, maybe I can, like, pull up a picture of it online and go take it to a Kinko's or some shit. I want a poster of that button. That's the dopest ass shit I've ever fucking seen.
He managed to garner nearly 1 million votes from inside that federal penitentiary. How did he do that? That's a question for you, Lisa.
Oh, I'm sorry. He did that because he had such a national following by then. It was 1920. He had been in the national newspapers for several years. People knew of his message. The IWW continued to support him. Labor unions continued to support him. And despite the fact that he was accused of encouraging people not to enlist in the military during World War I, which was extremely problematic, he still had a following among workers, among trade unionists, among socialists who believed in his message. So he did that because of his national reputation by then.
What were some of the other themes of the 1920 campaign?
Well, many of the socialist leaders, and Debs maybe a little less, but his campaigners said this is actually a vote for free speech. That this is an opportunity for all Americans, whether you're a socialist or not, to cast a vote in protest against the Wilson administration's. Debs embodied at that point all of the prisoners who were in prison and all of the actions that had been done by mob violence, by state laws, by the postal censor to squash dissenters, not just socialists, but pacifists of all kinds had been rounded up. And by 1920, many Americans who, in the grip of war fever had thought maybe that was a good idea, started to reconsider that. And they were particularly supported by a small group of people who became the American Civil Liberties Union in trying to advance their rights. And so there were only about 100,000 socialists, actually far less than that by this point. I think the number is something in the 20 to 30,000 dues-paying members at this point, and he got 1 million votes. Some of those people were socialists, but I think an awful lot of those people were actually voting for free speech.
Terre Haute, Indiana. This is Dave. Hi, Dave.
Hello. How are you all?
Great, thanks. Here we are in your town. Do you have a question about one of your famous citizens?
I do, and I'm a graduate of Indiana State University, the same university that you all are sitting on. What was Eugene V Debs' impact on the university at the time, if any? It was an Indiana normal school, and it was a school of educators. Did he have an influence, and what part did he take into the development of the university?
Thanks very much. Lisa Phillips, do you know?
You know, I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know if Eugene Debs had any kind of influence on Indiana State as a normal school in that period, but I am curious now to find out.
Syracuse, New York. Ralph, go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm a UAW worker from upstate New York, and I think that the problem was that you had at the time you had Eugene Debs, and you had the Socialist Labor Party, and then you had the Socialist Workers Party, and then you had Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor, and Gompers and Eugene Debs didn't see eye to eye, and I think that's a problem, that you never had a unified workers movement in this country, because it was splinter groups, and that was his problem, that was never able to achieve its goal.
This is the same thing I say all the time. We have no unification amongst the left. We still to this day don't have this. We have a bunch of splinter ass groups on the left that are off like trying to figure out their own way to fucking channel their movement. And it's like they're not all coming together. The whole reason that shit's never going to get fucking done with the left is because we're so busy organizing our own little niche groups, we can't come together on a common set of principles and ideals in order to push anything forward. So that's why we're going to be stuck with the Democratic Party and hoping that they move far enough left. Which fucking sucks, man. I feel like we should be able to have a third party, but we're too busy infighting. It's the stupidest shit I've ever seen in my life. You don't see that shit on the right, man. Not like you do on the left.
And I'd like to hear your guests would comment on that. Thank you very much.
Lisa Phillips.
There was a huge split. The caller is absolutely right in this period, and it continues to the present day, which among labor unions, with regard to the split between, in that period, it was craft unionism, which was embodied by the American Federation of Labor, versus industrial unionism, which is what Debs advocated through the IWW. And so Debs was after a working class movement where you erased the lines that divided skilled workers from unskilled workers, whereas the American Federation of Labor was composed of very tightly organized craft-based unions, whether they be coopers or plumbers or carpenters or bricklayers or that sort of thing. So it was a very different kind of approach toward representing working class interests, and they did not see eye to eye in continuing into the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and beyond.
Well, Debs campaigning for president in 1920. During the Wilson administration, twice his attorney general put before him clemency petitions. Why did Wilson say no?
It's a little complicated. Wilson was open to the idea initially, it seems, as a way to sort of clear the air after the war. He had a stroke. He seemed to sort of lose his moral compass. Many people felt, who were his supporters, who felt like this was an obvious gesture of goodwill that he might make. He heard from a lot of soldiers and their families that Debs was a traitor. I mean, it was certainly not just the government that considered Debs to be, and these others to have crossed the line. Debs was the embodiment of that dissent.
In fact, was there an active campaign with lots of money by the American Legion and veterans groups like that to keep Debs in jail?
Sure. I mean, that was one of their primary missions when they first organized after World War I. They said this was their priority number one, keep Debs in prison. The Ku Klux Klan was emerging at this point, and they also considered Debs and the other radicals that it was important that they stay in prison. So there was a lot of pressure on.
You guys just like making me do squats so you can look at my ass. Fucking ass lookers.
The president, and not a lot of political gain, I think, in his judgment to release.
So then how did he secure an early release?
Well, Wilson left office, and then the whole process of putting pressure on the president began again with Warren Harding. People were in the amnesty movement were a lot less optimistic about convincing Harding, because Harding was a conservative, pro-business Republican who seemed to have less motivation. There were plenty of socialists who supported Wilson. It seemed like Wilson would be the one to let the socialists out of prison. But Harding, he campaigned on this idea of returning the country to a pre-war normalcy to sort of stop these tensions. And the protest movement.
So Harding sounds a lot like Biden now.
The amnesty movement to try to get Debs out of prison was not just the election, but it was a huge movement. There were petitions being gathered on the streets of Terre Haute and all across the country, massive petition drives. They would have to bring the petitions in on the back of a pickup truck to deliver to the White House.
You guys done did it. You made me have to work out. I gotta pee first if I'm gonna do that. Ah, shit. All right, give me just a second. I'm gonna put the video on so you guys can keep watching, but I'll be right back, and then I'll do your fucking workouts.
Many, people from across Europe and the United States, George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells and H.L. Mencken and Helen Keller. I mean, many people are involved in this movement to try to get the prisoners out. And I think for Harding, he had no interest in inheriting this mess from Wilson. So in the name of normalcy, he waited a little while and then he let Debs out of prison.
And not only let him out, but invited him to the White House.
That's right.
And Debs went?
Debs went, yeah.
And what do we know about that meeting?
Neither one of them said anything about it. Harding said something like, I'm so damn glad to meet you. It was a Christmas afternoon meeting, I guess, and Debs came out and said, Harding seems like a very nice man. I believe he said, that the president asked me to tone down my rhetoric, but I have no intention of doing that. And then he got back on the train and headed to Terre Haute.
You're looking at some extremely rare footage. I don't know that it's been seen before on TV of Debs coming out of the White House and speaking to the media after his meeting with the president there. He lived until 1926. We have just about 10 minutes left, and let's get a couple calls, and then we'll talk more about his legacy. Ann Arbor, Michigan. James, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Look, if I have two questions.
Go ahead, James.
Hi. I have two questions.
All right, I'm going to move on.
Hello?
James, yes, we can hear you. Ask your question, please. All right, let's move on, please. I'm sorry, because our time is short. Next up is a call from Graham in Charleston, South Carolina. Go ahead.
Hey, good evening. My question, I just want to know what you think, if any, Debs movement could exist in modern-day America with the development of global capitalism, and then what you think Debs would think about the Tea Party movement that's going on currently. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's always a tough thing for historians, isn't it, to project what a historical character might think of today. But you want to take a stab at it?
It needs to be done with real caution. Well, first thing I would say is that global capitalism is not something new. That was very much an issue with the flow of immigrants and the flow of capital and the worldwide nature of capitalism in Debs' own day. So sometimes it seems we overstate the distinctive global nature of the economy that we live in now. As far as the Tea Party goes, Lisa?
Well, he certainly wouldn't have been in agreement with the Tea Party support of big business. That's the simplest way I can put it. And I don't know. His message still resonates, I think, with us today, and we're still facing some of the same problems that he was fighting against as a result of workers' wages being driven down by the policies of now global multinational corporations, and not just in the U.S. but worldwide. So he certainly would have a lot to say about the same types of things that have escalated from his period to today. And I'm sure he would still be against the negative impact of multinational corporations now globally. So
you have a final artifact for us to look at, his cell block keys?
Yes.
Look at the size of those.
I know, they're huge.
And why don't I use the reminder of his prison term to have you help us kind of finish out our program here with our last 6 or 7 minutes left. How is he viewed by the labor movement today? How do they look back on his time and his contributions?
Well, sir, I just attended a banquet last week put on by...
Oh, you guys got me doing all sorts of shit. Hang on, I gotta put sunglasses on. There you go. I can't see shit!
The Debs Foundation, where many labor trade unionists were, and Danny Glover was in attendance, and everyone remembers Debs for being a spokesperson for the working class, and he continues to carry that legacy for workers in this country and beyond. So it certainly resonates here in Terre Haute and among trade unionists across the country, I would argue.
As we think about his final years, I was showing you before we started here, the Time magazine, Monday, November 1st, 1926, his obituary with the headline, Radicals, Eugene V Debs. Here's what they wrote. On Christmas Day, 1921, President Harding pardoned a model prisoner, a broken prophet. Around him, he saw his Socialist Party disintegrating. Within him, he felt his strength ebbing. His speeches seem almost pathetic. His pen had lost his throb. A month ago, he went to a sanitarium in Elmhurst, Illinois, where he died, age 71. What were his final years like after prison? And how important a voice was he in those last years?
That was a horrible thing that she just read about him. Like, fucking, are you serious, man? You couldn't find anything better to say?
He spent the rest of his life trying to rebuild the Socialist Party that had been so badly splintered by the war without success. And that was both a self-inflicted wound, because the Socialist Party itself had a bitter split over communism. And it was a very difficult thing for him. The communists were trying to convince him to join them, to be, he was the country's most famous, most high-profile and beloved radical, and the communists wanted very...
Hey, Space Explorer 813, yeah, I'm a leftist, but I let everybody in here. As long as you're not an asshole and you treat people with respect and show them some love, fucking we Gucci, baby. Just don't be like, racist and shit, and don't be a bigot, fucking, don't bully people and shit. But you're welcome to your own beliefs, and, I'm happy to debate them and talk to you about them. It's cool. Like, don't sweat it. It's a safe space.
Very much to have him on board. And Debs had been very enthusiastic about the Bolshevik Revolution, but he refused ultimately to sign on with the communists, objecting to the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat and objecting to some of the methods of the Bolsheviks. So he was left with a half a party. Much of the young energy had gone into the Communist Party at this point. Meanwhile, the party had been smashed by legal attacks and as well as mob attacks during the war. So he tried to rebuild the party for those years without a whole lot of success.
He is buried here in Terre Haute, Indiana at Highland Lawn Cemetery. We have some video of his gravesite, and we're going to look at that as we listen to Manny from New York City.
Yes.
I don't even know that I could entirely call myself like a diehard socialist. Like, I think that if you were to really, I think that there's what I would refer to myself as is somebody who appreciates practical socialism, insofar as it is built into a blended economy that still has a market, so maybe a market socialist. But, you know, I'm just for the general well-being of the public and the people, and if we're able to provide that through taxes, I'd rather our taxes go to stuff like that, you know, like Medicare for all type stuff, than I would other shit. So, you know, that's all. Like, you know, I think that, you know, when you have billionaires making all these fucking billions of dollars and we have people living on the street, we could probably figure out a way to redistribute a little bit of that. But I still think that you need to be able to have a meritocracy in some sense and be able to gain some value, you know, out of the work that you do. If you do extra work, you should, you know, be rewarded extra, you know. And, you know, I think that's where I probably diverged from a lot of other people that represent socialist ideals.
My question is, what were Eugene Debs' view on the Russian Revolution and on Marx and Lenin in particular? And did he visit Russia at this time? And can you separate socialism from Marxism during this time period? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Huge topics and not much time.
Right. Well, he did not visit Russia. There was an attempt to get him to go to Russia. The Bolsheviks considered Debs to be an American hero. And he was, as I said, an admirer of the Bolshevik Revolution, but ultimately felt like the things the Bolsheviks did in Russia were not appropriate for American socialism. That Americans, in spite of all he had experienced, being sent to prison twice for his actions, he still believed in American democracy and still believed that the way forward for American workers was to organize in unions and to support the Socialist Party.
We have another Terre Haute call. It's great to have people locally participating. This is Todd. Go ahead, Todd.
Hi, I'm calling from Terre Haute, and I'd like to thank you for this program. For Lisa, who I understand is a member of the Eugene V Debs Foundation, I'd like her to address Debs' continuing legacy of peace,
hashtag man bear pig is real,
justice, and let people know how they might pursue their interest in Debs if they want to know something more about him.
Certainly. Well, there, you know, in this age of technology, there's a website devoted to the Debs Foundation, so that's certainly an easy way to access more information about the Debs Foundation and about what's here in the Debs house and about Debs.
Anyways, that's all just like logistical. That's like the last minute of it. We're not getting any new insights out of the last minute there, where they're just talking about the